All right, Laura Blumenfeld is a Middle East analyst at Johns Hopkins University. She joins me now for more. Laura, welcome to the show. We now have Hamas's initial response to Sinwar's killing. How optimistic should we be that his death could lead to any kind of resolution of this current conflict?
Yeah, I think it's a moment of great promise and great peril. I mean, we have some promise. The Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, offered amnesty to Hamas fighters who laid down their arms. He said to them very clearly, leave and live. If they release the hostages, there's a deal to be made. Secretary Blinken, our Secretary of State, is flying to the region looking for a broader ceasefire deal. That said, there is great peril. Both Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, if we're looking at the whole ring of fire, seem to be hardening their positions, which gives great concern, particularly for the hostage lives, and then beyond that for the war continuing. And then there's this looming strike on Iran that Israel has been promising in retaliation for a missile strike on Israel back on October 1st. So there's military momentum behind Israel, which makes me think we may not be quite at the end of the fighting phase quite yet.
At the same time, we know that Sinwar's potential successors are generally seen as moderate by comparison. Do we have any sense of what that could mean for the scope of the conflict and how Hamas will come back from this?
Well, I think, Sinwar is dead. Hamas is very much alive. But desperate men, desperate measures. For Israel, it's all about the hostages from a kind of public opinion point of view and political support for Netanyahu. So if there's desperation and, kind of weakness and a fracturing of the Hamas leadership, that could be very dangerous. I think that Netanyahu and his Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, are kind of on I don't know, they're channeling a lot of biblical quotes there of an eye for an eye, and we will take down our enemies. He was quoted, the Secretary of Defense was quoting from Leviticus yesterday, saying that we will beat our enemies with swords. So I just worry that this kind of decentralization of control under Hamas could potentially lead to even more violence.
You touched on this a bit, but what does Sinwar's death mean in this broader conflict between Israel and its enemies? You mentioned Iran, you mentioned the fight against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Does this embolden Israel in a way even more to continue with those despite all of the international pressure? What do you see?
With all the problems in Gaza, Israel actually has a larger problem, which is Iran, nuclear weapons and a global network of hostile proxies. So I do think Israel's very much focused on Iran as the next step. I would look toward next week. Thursday night going into Friday is the Jewish anniversary of the holiday of Simchat Torah, where that first ambush took place on the secular calendar. It would be October 7th, but for the Jewish state, it's next week. So I think, when I spoke to my sources, Israeli intelligence sources, and I said, is there going to be a strike before the U.S. election or after? The answer was both. So that strike on Iran is probably going to be the next step, unless Secretary Blinken succeeds with his proposal. And I would just suggest that he go modest, because the higher the diving board, the bigger the belly flop. And that could be embarrassing for the United States, especially 18 days out from the presidential election.
We talk about Sinwar's death as a potential turning point. You've mentioned the election. How significant a turning point is that potentially for what's going on?
Well, President Biden, as he spoke today, he said that he had a phone call with Netanyahu and he told him to choose to seek a path toward peace. The issue with Netanyahu is I think that path might involve a trip to Tehran by the Israeli Air Force. I mean, we share the same goals as Israel. Everybody wants Israel to push back against that axis of resistance and defeat terrorism. The question is at what cost? For Israel, it is at all costs, because they see it as an existential fight. For the United States, there are many priorities, right? There's international prestige, given the humanitarian crisis that's really put a dent in the United States' credibility abroad. There's our other priorities of pushing back on China and aggressive Russia. It's divided the Democratic Party for this administration. It's also opened them up to charges of looking weak and inept. So I think the next couple of days are going to be really important. This is our October surprise, I think, Sinwar's death. And the question is how we can leverage that potentially toward a solution, which eventually will have to be something political on the horizon.
That's Laura Blumenfeld with Johns Hopkins University. Thank you very much.
Thank you.